Hey, we're live again, one more time.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, we can even hear now Scott. I received so many complaints from the video I published about Backstage, where I actually had a conversation with you. I had
Yeah.
private and one public complaint, kind of like, this is great, man. But I have no idea what Scott is saying. It hurts my ears.
Well, luckily, that's over now with this microphone, hopefully.
Okay, so ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls, type your questions. This session is all about your questions. None yet. Don't disappoint. In the meantime, Scott, what are you up to? Still focused exclusively on Backstage plugin outside
Backstage
of the
plugins, Crossplane providers, using Upjet, bunch of just platform engineering, fun stuff.
Oh man,
Exactly.
the other day when we were talking, I don't know whether it was live or no. Anyways, you mentioned cursor, right?
Yeah.
And I went to their website. Two things happened. First, I saw it, and I remember, heck, I tried that half a year ago. It's the same thing as GitHub, GitHub Copilot. Same thing. I tried it, 5 minutes, gave up. Why would I switch?
Okay.
Then I thought, no, but there must be a reason why Scott told me to use this, right? So I forced myself to use it exclusively instead of VS Code for probably like 2 weeks now. It's amazing.
And yeah,
It's amazing. It's kind of, but it's not obviously amazing. Kind of like,
right.
I cannot even easily describe what makes it. It just kind of simply flows better.
Yeah. Exactly.
And recommendations are better as well.
But it's also faster.
Oh yeah, it's much faster. And there are details like GitHub Copilot. If I don't have the file, it just works on the files that are open. This guy kind of tells you, hey, can you write tests for my code? Yeah, this is what I found out in your code base. I'm going to open the files for you and then do the stuff. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
I love it.
No,
I love it.
Too.
Okay,
Ooh,
so we have one.
Question.
Yeah. From Ahmed, what do you think about using New Relic? Is it reliable to send telemetry data to cloud instead of using open source on-premise solutions? I haven't used New Relic as much as others, so I don't have a concrete experience with. How's your New Relic?
So I've used New Relic a bit. Don't have a huge amount of experience with it, but the answer is that if you are going to use New Relic or any other SaaS solution or on-prem enterprise solution, as long as a New Relic does supports you sending it OTel metrics and you use an OTel collector, then it doesn't matter what you're using. Simply do not use like the New Relic SDKs within your applications to send metrics. Use OpenTelemetry and send it through the collector, at which point it just comes down to what you prefer from a UX experience of you like this one versus another. It's all about just now we have a standard. Let's stick to that standard. It's like, I don't care if you use Prometheus or Victoria metrics or anything else, as long as it holds by the standard of Prometheus metrics, which is the de facto standard.
Yeah, so you just contradicted yourself. You said OpenTelemetry.
No, both of them, right? You need both, right?
True,
for telemetry that you're sending to an APM, right? New Relic is an APM. It's not really a Grafana it's not New Relic versus Grafana. Right? It's New Relic versus Splunk versus Datadog versus it's in that world. It's more the APM larger solutions, in which case OpenTelemetry is critical. For standard metrics, it's Prometheus because it's still the de facto standard. And most languages or some languages still don't have good support from OTel for things beyond traces, especially logs, which is terrible in most languages.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm not that kind of. To me, OpenTelemetry matters a lot for traces. I don't even want to have a discussion about whether to use it or not. Absolutely, 100%, right?
Exactly.
Prometheus format still for metrics, but logs, I'm not sure that I care that much. Kind of
Okay.
that it's a standard format. Well, I mean, it's good. It's cool. A better standard than no standard, but you're still sending relatively small amount of. You're sending text at the end of the day.
Yeah, again, I think that there are best practices that should always be followed. For example, JSON formatted logs and things like that, so that you're not writing stupid parsers based off of spaces and tabs and weird things, and you should be printing out structured logs from your application. I'm not sure we necessarily need a standard for shipping those logs, although if anyone were to ever ask me, the answer is FluentBit, FluentBit, unless you are using the full Grafana stack, at which point Promtail and Loki.
But the second part of the question, to send telemetry data to cloud, which is not necessarily applies to only to New Relic, but in general,
right?
Instead of using open source on-premise solutions, if I exclude the pricing from the equation, right? I'm always going to say use a service.
So the thing, again, obviously anything that you don't need to manage is going to be easier. It also means you have less customization and all of that, right? So there's always a trade-off between the two. In the end, when it comes to cloud versus that, I think it really is just a price question a lot of times. And the other question, beyond like data sovereignty or like things like that, if you have regulations, then obviously you have to stay on-prem and things like that, like, or whatever. But the other thing is how much data do you need to pull out from there? And this is more true with like AWS services or Azure services or Google services where you pay egress traffic. And it becomes things that you put in the cloud. If you're in a hybrid solution, being in the cloud sometimes will cost you a lot more than just the licensing, because you're also paying to get that data
of course.
out from there.
Of course.
So
that's why I answered in a politically correct way if you ignore prices.
Exactly. No, but prices is not just price of a license, right?
Oh yeah. Price is many different things. Exactly. But it's curious what you said about if you're not regulated. And I'm not sure. Sometimes you cannot do something because you're regulated, but very often company where you work might apply their interpretation of regulation rather than really deny you to do things because of regulation itself. I mean, U.S. government is regulated. Kind of.
Yeah.
There are very often ways how to actually keep following the rules by making different implementation of those rules instead of, somebody in your company 17 years ago decided that you need to SSH into every single server separately because of some regulation, and nobody started questioning anymore what the actual regulation is. In my experience, most people even don't know what the regulation is. They just know that...
Forget the regulation itself. How many... it's always based off of who the person that's doing your audit for that regulation and also what they say. Like, I've worked with dozens of customers that have PCI compliance requirements. Every single one, what they've been told by their compliance officers is completely different what you need from a Kubernetes perspective, right? Like, no, we need X, A, B, C. It's like, I just did this by like 20 other customers and no, they didn't. It's like, yeah, but our auditor says that PCI requires, it's all interpretation. It's way too vague.
Well, there is a solution to that. Take the auditor to a very expensive dinner, followed by alcohol.
And then have him sign off on the audit.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, auditors are actually even more complicated because they very often, and I'm throwing them under the bus here, apologies to auditors in the audience, but they are very often, they're not really trying to figure out whether you comply with regulation. Yeah, they have their rules. Oh, if logs are not like this, it does not follow. Those are the rules. I don't know anything about anything anyway, but I can read ABC. Anyways, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Mikola, imagine you're a middle DevOps engineer now, and you decided to switch jobs. You have some knowledge on Linux, Kubernetes, AWS, CI/CD, and 3 years of some experience, but no Kubernetes. which is contradictory. At the beginning, you said some knowledge of Kubernetes, but not Kubernetes.
But no experience. So my guess is just like playing around with it, things like that. But yeah.
I mean, I would always tell people to start with Linux. And you seem to have covered that. I don't know whether you covered it on theoretical level or practical, right? But Kubernetes is not, it's been 10 years. There is no company, hardly any company on a planet that doesn't use Kubernetes to some extent. And I'm choosing my words carefully. That might be 0.5% of the workloads. It might be in a lab somewhere, but there is Kubernetes absolutely everywhere. And to me, that's a requirement today. Kind of like you cannot not know Kubernetes if you're on the upside of the equation. Simply no.
Yeah.
You cannot. Now we can discuss whether you will be specialized in Kubernetes. It's a separate discussion, but understanding and have practical knowledge, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. I think that in the end, my answer to this is always the same. From everything that you've mentioned here, there are a lot of jobs in the market that need them, whether it's to go and work with, writing CI/CD pipelines, whether it's to be a cloud architect or a cloud infrastructure manager, whatever, or Kubernetes, engineers, or Linux and all of that. There's still sysadmins for Linux and all of that. What interests you? Because you will only be good at what interests you in the end. So what you need to figure out is what interests you here in terms of your next steps. And what interests you, that's what you should be pushing at to get as your next job and all of that. Don't just try. You see a lot of people that go and try and find the job based off of, okay, I can get X amount of money if I go to this job. And I'm not saying that doesn't matter. Money is important. But in the end, for you to really reach your potential and all of that, you have to like what you're doing.
Absolutely. But it's also that I do believe that if you're really specialized, if you become really proficient at something, it does not ultimately matter what that is. You can be really proficient in mainframe and you will have a great life. Amazing. Assuming that
you'll have a much better life than someone that's proficient in Kubernetes.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's more people that are proficient in Kubernetes than in mainframe. So actually, the more scarce it is, the harder it is to find a job, but the better paying typically and the better off you'll be with that job in most cases.
Now, but there is a but there, right? If you end up having some experience but not being proficient in something, then it does matter what that is from the job eligibility perspective. Now,
exactly.
So to keep a mainframe, I'm interested in mainframe. Great. Kind of company wants me to do mainframe. Great. But I'm going to have some passing knowledge with it because it's together with other things and what's not. That will not make you job eligible. Right. So either go deep or go for hype.
Right.
One of those two things.
Yeah.
Okay. Peter, we're looking at which PostgreSQL operator to use for production HADB as a service on Kubernetes. Some folks like... You took my steam from my sails, man. Absolutely. Yes. CMPG. There we go. I think he joined even CNCF not long ago.
Did it?
I think so. I'm not 100%.
Okay.
I think it did. Anyways, CMPG. Easy.
Yeah.
No need to read the rest of the questions. If it's self-managed, just to be clear.
Yes. Again, if it's talking about deploying in Kubernetes, then 100% it should be CNPG. I think there's no question about that. And if it's not, then, and you just need to manage it from Kubernetes, you can use Crossplane with a self-hosted something, with like a hosted RDS or something like that.
I mean, I use Crossplane even with CMPG. I would never use Crossplane for CMPG alone, just to be clear. But for example, I like to wrap database together with schema and a few other and external secrets for blah, blah, blah. And then when I'm doing more than one, then I would use Crossplane even for that. But that's because I'm a Crossplane freak, so you might not want to take that seriously.
Yeah.
Okay, from Anthony. In case of a disaster and losing an entire Kubernetes cluster with tons of Crossplane resources, compositions, and so on, do you think just resync with GitOps is enough, or should I use a Kubernetes backup?
You need Kubernetes backup.
Absolutely. Most likely. Let me put most likely, right? If your resources can be named, I don't have a better term. So, for example, if you have all you have is GKE cluster, right? You can easily restore it for backup because the name of your cluster is identification of that cluster. Sorry, not from backup, from a Git repo. A lapsus.
Yeah.
Now, if you use resources that auto-generate names, like VPC in AWS, right? You
Anything in AWS.
Not necessarily. No, not any. Like EKS itself uses the name you give it. That's the identification.
Does it? External name? Okay.
It's the same as the name you gave it.
The ARN.
Huh?
Okay.
Yeah, not all AWS, but
right.
Sufficient. You will not eventually. You will not end up with it without at least one resource that has auto-generated names. And then if you synchronize it in a different cluster with Git, with Argo CD or Flux, you will, let's say VPC, right? You have a name called it Victor, but AWS realistically auto-generated the names XYZ, whatever it is. You apply with Crossplane. Crossplane says Victor doesn't exist over there. Let me create a new one. Because it doesn't know how to relate the existing resource with the auto-generated ID with what you told it should be called. That's I'm always mixing annotation, I think, not the label, right?
It's an annotation.
Annotation.
Of crossplane.io/external name.
Yes. Now, this is not something that in practice you can do, but in theory, if you would add that annotation to your manifest,
right,
then you can restore it from Git. You need that annotation for the auto-generated identification.
Yes, but how are you exactly going to do that with a resource created through a composite? Because
I said in theory.
I mean,
so you can expose. You can have VPC
within your claim that allows you to set what the VPC external name is, and then add it back in. And yes, don't do that.
In theory. Whenever I say theory, it means don't do it. It's possible. So yeah, you need the backup. Yes. Now, the order of the backup and many other annoyances with backups does not matter. You just throw it. Eventually, it will figure it out. So no need to think much about how you create it, how you restore it, which I don't guarantee for other resources, but for Crossplane itself, it should be fine.
Yeah.
Okay, Luther. Have you seen companies with large cloud infrastructure move away from Terraform to Crossplane or other products that allows scaling and abstraction for service teams? How would you do it? So I would say that over 90% of Crossplane users come from Terraform. And the reason is very simple. People who haven't used any infrastructure as code in the past, for them, Crossplane is too big of a step. Kind of like, it's just too much, right? Kind of too advanced. Those are rarely people, they have much bigger problems to solve than Crossplane, and more basic problems, right? Yeah. So almost all people who adopt Crossplane have some mechanism to manage stuff, whether that's Terraform or Pulumi or Ansible,
the CloudFormation,
CloudFormation, exactly,
or whatever, right?
Yes. So if you say not only Terraform, I would say over 90%. Don't hold me for that. If you say some infrastructure is code, then I would say close to 100%.
Yeah, I would agree as well. And in terms of how I would do it, in the end, it really comes down to your resources, what types of things you're creating, and all of that. Really, the number one thing that I consider in these things is the best way to start is to consider what you would re-architect in terms of like your Terraform modules today. Every company typically has Terraform modules, and they didn't just do like flat main TFs. If you did flat main TFs, then completely re-architect everything. If you did modules, start thinking of what you could break up, what makes sense, what you would want to reorganize, and try to build those prototypes in Crossplane. Build out those modules, and then start to work on the migrations, all of that. But get the code working for you in the new way you want. A lot of people just say like, okay, let's migrate everything in and then we'll refactor. Switching between tools is the perfect time to refactor. So yes, it's going to take a longer process, but otherwise it's going to be horrible and you'll never refactor. So refactor first, then...
In a perfect world, I would say actually migrate, refactor. That makes more logical and practical sense, because you can migrate and then start chipping away or moving piece by piece. But in practice, I agree with you, Scott, kind of like managers in general say, okay, now everything is managed by Kubernetes.
Exactly.
Let's move our efforts somewhere else. In practice, migrations don't work.
Right. Lift and shift is the
lift and shift doesn't work, yeah.
Right. Lift and shift simply has proven itself too often to lose priority after the lift.
Okay, next one. What is your opinion on managing PostgreSQL in Kubernetes? Today we have relatively mature operators like CloudNet, EPG, and Zalando. Would you still prefer managed database, or would you run it in Kubernetes? I will give the same answer, ignoring the price, because you need to do the calculation. Ignoring the price, managed database. And probably database is the first thing I would run as managed, or one of the first things. Ignoring the price. Now, price depends, as Scott mentioned earlier, it's a price of the service. It's a price of, but you need to compare that with the price of your hardware and with the price of people. And people affect a lot. Like an engineer that you're going to use paid in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco, it does not cost the same as somewhere else, right?
Right.
That's why I don't like to give the definitive answer. It depends on the price. But if the numbers are right, don't bother with on-prem.
The one thing that I would say with, do you run it in Kubernetes or do you use a managed service, is the one other use case. I completely agree with what you were saying there, except one other use case, which is if you are multi-cloud or you are building a solution that you're going to need to host possibly in on-prem, in multi-cloud, in all of this, you're typically better off building things that are self-contained, because the ease, if let's say you built a SaaS solution right now and you have tenants for customers, right? And this happens all the time, that you decide that I'm running on Azure, but now you have a customer that says we only use SaaS offerings that are hosted in AWS. So now you need to deploy to AWS. If you were using Azure SQL, right, their managed SQL, and now you need to move to AWS, the authentication is a bit different. The versions that are supported may be a bit different. The different features that you have or exposing of different like capabilities of Postgres may be a bit different here. And you're going to run into challenges. If you're doing that, CNPG all the way, right? Like run it 100%. In Kubernetes. If it's just for an internal stuff and you aren't moving right between clouds and price is right, yes, use the SaaS solution. Take off that responsibility from yourself.
Yeah, 100%. If it's multi-cloud, I want to make this clear. I might have wrong experience. There are actually not many real usages of multi-cloud. People dream about it more than do it. They end up spending a ton of money to do what you're saying, Scott, to end up being in AWS, and just in case one day, tomorrow, we might be multi-cloud. In that case, you should still run CMPG, but don't go crazy kind of, right. I'm going to make everything agnostic and all those things.
SaaS offerings is one of the only ones where that actually like ends up happening, right? It doesn't end up happening with like end user companies, multi-cloud, nearly. Like, again, almost all companies are multi-cloud today, if not everyone. But not one application being multi-cloud with
Exactly.
the ability to move it around. Everyone's multi-cloud today when you have Azure Entra ID or Azure Active Directory or whatever you want to call it, and you're using Google Drive, right? Great, you're multi-cloud.
Yeah.
But an application is typically in one cloud and doesn't just move around.
Exactly. Okay, for apps running on Kubernetes clusters, why is it more safe to integrate ESO with external secret stores for central management of secrets rather than using external secret stores only?
It is not more safe. It's actually less safe than pulling in from the SDK of Vault, or from the SDK of AWS, Secrets Manager and all of that stuff, or even Secret Store CSI, which is a more secure solution, right? ESO is the least secure of the secure solutions, is the way that I always view it. But it is
because
also
it's generic
solution. It's the one solution that is going to work always. Secret Store CSI may work for your apps. It will almost never work for third-party apps because they simply expect to take a secret in. It's not going to work for Ingress TLS things because it expects a secret. It's not going to work for a lot of stuff. So that's why ESO makes sense, because it's simply the most common denominator in the most secure way possible.
And it's good. Okay. What do you think about Red Hat Developer Hub? It has dynamic plugins which loads the plugins on the boot. It avoids the pain of editing up TXX and route TXX directly. This is you, Scott. You're the house expert on Backstage.
Yeah. So I am a huge fan of the work that Red Hat have been doing upstream, now also in the community, contributing it back and working with the whole community on dynamic plugins. I think that is what is going to make Backstage really shoot forwards in terms of user experience and make it much less difficult to manage, especially for companies that don't need to build their own plugins and just want to integrate a bunch of tools. It's going to be a great experience. Red Hat Developer Hub shows us the path to that. My one worry is, again, like anything that starts downstream, even if it's open source, like it was with the Yanis IDP that Red Hat started with, until the actually RFC and the implementation gets implemented upstream in Backstage, the chances of me needing to change how I do stuff or them being continuing a fork versus what happens upstream is what I worry about, which is why I'm a huge supporter of what they're doing. I love the work going on. I personally believe in waiting until it gets merged upstream. The second it is alpha, the front-end dynamic plugins, I will be the first person installing it, testing it, trying to convert my plugins into dynamic plugins to give back feedback to the community. I think that they're moving in the right direction. I love the fact that they've contributed. Red Hat have been doing amazing stuff with Developer Hub. They contributed almost all of their plugins to the Backstage community. They're not under Red Hat anymore. They're part of the Backstage org. Which is amazing. Seeing Red Hat really involved here in this upstream community is a great thing to see. I just personally have a bit of an aversion from previous history, from other vendors, from Red Hat, from whatever, that end up maintaining forks for a long time, because what ends up getting merged upstream is just a bit too different from what their initial implementation was.
To me, that feels... And I'm not that much in Backstage as you are. It feels similar like dilemma with Kubernetes. I always admired the amount of contribution and work that Red Hat put into Kubernetes itself. And on the other hand, I could never swallow the OpenShift pill. Kind of like, they were at the same time doing something that is really amazing, but offering me to use something that I don't want to use. Kind of too risky for me to be on OpenShift.
Exactly, because you end up kind of locking yourself in. It's like, yes, they created routes, which ended up creating ingress in Kubernetes. Okay,
Yeah.
ingress in Kubernetes did not exist. Red Hat created routes, went with the idea upstream. Upstream invented ingress, which is a bit too different from routes that we're still stuck with routes till today in OpenShift. Now, it supports ingress already, but we're still stuck with that. The same thing happened with like Cluster API. OpenShift needed to release OpenShift, and they had Cluster API was not at the maturity level yet, so they took the machine API from there at a very initial alpha version of the API, continued that, and they're slowly bringing in Cluster API into OpenShift, but it's taking multiple years. It's these things that you end up veering from the upstream, which makes it so you can't enjoy the upstream, fruits as easily once you start with that forking off until they come back to the main line. Which is why, again, amazing work.
But
I love what they're doing, but I personally recommend more things like Rody if you're looking for SaaS, or just to wait a few months until we get this, in a good version in Backstage.
Okay. Next one from Alexander, probably. How painful are bare metal Kubernetes compared to AWS EKS, let's say in the enterprise world? Thanks. It's not painful at all initially. And the pain increases over time. That's at least...
It's painful from day zero. It's painful day 0, day 1, day 2, day 1 million. It is painful. It's a lot more that you need to manage. It limits you in a lot of cases. Unless you have a serious team that is maintaining all of the bare metal infrastructure, and you have something like a cloud stack with, let's say, like bare metal, or you have like Canonical MAS, more likely Canonical MAS, Metal 3, whatever, as that gives you that cloud experience above bare metal, or Metal 3 and all of that stuff is great. It adds a lot of complexity, though. It makes everything much slower. So when you want to, create a new node, or add a new node, or delete a node, you're going to wait 20 minutes for the boot for it to, do things. Versus if you were on vSphere or KVM or anything like that, a virtualization, let's say on-prem, it's a few seconds, it clones a template and you have a new node, right? Like, it's much easier to maintain than bare metal is. It has its benefits, though, from performance. On average, virtualization adds 30% performance degradation over bare metal. And that's running vSphere, which is the best performance hypervisor. So, pros and cons.
I mean, and there is also the thing with... So let's say that you pick distribution X to run yourself, whatever that distribution is, right? As opposed to, let's say, EKS. Now, when the new version of Kubernetes comes, and AWS releases that as new release of EKS itself, it works. It does. Somebody did the work for you. That distribution that you are using might not even work on that hardware. Right? In that combination, and whatever you were doing, you simply don't know.
Right. Which is where what I would say, if you are doing bare metal, you absolutely must, in my mind, use a distribution. It is always the right thing to do to use a distribution, but you need a commercial support here. That can be from OpenShift that has bare metal to, like, my favorite, which is SpectroCloud that has bare metal support through Canonical MAS. Right? So you have things like that. You have multiple different tools that do this. But you need something commercial. It could be EKS Anywhere, by the way. They support bare metal as well through Tinkerbell, right? Like, it doesn't matter which solution, but get something that has support, because you're going to need to call 1-800 support line quite often with bare metal.
Okay, next one from Nakas, probably. When using CMPG, can I use local PV, ZVS, CSI driver for higher IOPS and fast backup restore with volume snapshots? Local storage means data loss, but CMPG replication will reduce this risk. I haven't tried it with ZFS, but I would say that So CMPG, like many other things, and that's the beauty of Kubernetes itself. It's a standard. It doesn't care which CSI driver you use. Of course, some will be better than others, but you can hook it into what's the local? My brain stopped. Help me, Scott. What's the local storage?
Local path or whatever, the one.
Yeah, exactly. You can even use that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Should you? Absolutely not. I think that anyone that uses local volumes in Kubernetes really should go and check themselves, because they either are masochists or they have the 1 in a million use case where something like that may be at some level valid. Local volumes in Kubernetes is horrifyingly terrible if it is for actual persistent data that matters. It's just not the right solution. Again, as you mentioned here, with CNPG replication and WAL, it reduces the risk. But do you want to reduce the risk? How much? When it's talking about production data in a database, I would say you want to eliminate the risk as much as possible and not just reduce it.
I mean, databases are probably the last thing on your list of reducing the risk.
Correct.
Oh, sorry. And having less risk instead of no risk. Sorry.
And the other thing that I will say is that this comes also to like that question of bare metal, right? We said performance 30% better, right? Storage, local storage is going to be always faster than remote storage. However, notice the fact that when you look at the statistics that come from AWS of how people are running things in EKS is still in 95% of cases, if not more probably, running on virtual machine EC2 instances and not bare metal instances. And people are using EBS and EFS CSI way more than they're using local volumes on bare metal nodes. So what does that tell us? In the end, even in the #1 used Kubernetes distribution in the world with the most clusters, where all of the big companies are running, somehow remote storage and virtual machines is not an issue. So the fact you can get better does not mean you need better. And that's very important.
Okay. Then we have basically thank you from Vakeguru saying that he loves what Red Hat is doing, and I love what Red Hat is doing. Scott loves. I'm not necessarily in love of how they're doing, but I love what they're doing. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. And they are contributing a huge amount upstream, and there is the public PR, and there's great stuff going on there. So again, completely supportive of what they're doing. I just like staying more upstream.
There we go. Okay. Next one from Dogus. My teammates are complaining about SonarQube standards. How can I convince them that it is useful? I have a love and hate relationship. I don't know yours, Scott, with SonarQube. I think that the idea is good. You get visibility. I'm not even talking about specifically SonarQube, but SonarQube-like tools. Idea is good. You get visibility. In most of the cases, and this is probably me working maybe with wrong companies, it ended up being more of a burden than actually benefit. Because people start looking at vanity metrics. So I don't know whether that's human nature or I worked with wrong companies, start getting some, like, here's the thing. Let's say test code coverage, right? I think it's very important, but it's important to give you an idea of where you can improve and what's not as something to chase. I've seen companies that go for close to 100% test coverage just to have really horrible tests. I prefer 10% with good tests, kind of. Just as long as you don't take it as a vanity metric, it's fine. So.
I agree. I will say I do not have a love-hate relationship. I have a hate relationship and an admiration. I admire these tools, but I have never loved them, right? I notice their necessity. I believe that any company that does not have code coverage tests or like code quality tests or code smell tests is not doing the right thing. I think you need all of those. how much of it is a blocking gate versus not a blocking gate. What do you require? What do you not require? Are you treating it as a vanity metric or not? That all is very important. But no matter what, you should have all of these tests being run so that you have the data, right? That is very important, I think, to have. And that's basically what the industry has also said. And I don't like going against the industry when I don't need to, although I often do.
I was puzzled for a second what this man is talking about.
I don't like to, I just do. However, SonarQube, I think, is, a necessity, or tools like it are a necessity, even though none of us like it, right? Who likes Dependabot? I know 0 people that do. However, it's a necessity because otherwise we would never bump versions.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right? So there are necessities in life. It's not something to like or hate. It's just something that we have to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, I have maybe you said you have only hate relationship and I was more positive, but over time I might actually turn on being worse than you. I think that I've seen so many negative outcomes of SonarQube. It will not fix any of your problems. It will just surface them and you're going to abuse it in some form or way. But that's me.
But the only way to actually make change is also to have the data, right? Data is a dangerous thing because it can be used in very bad ways as well.
Yeah.
But without the data, you're never going to get better either. You don't know where you need to fix your stuff. So
that's true.
You need the data. It's just you have to be careful of how you use that data.
Okay. From Tin, cluster autoscaler versus Karpenter. Any good reasons to switch from CA to Karpenter? I will assume, and Tin, correct me if I'm wrong as a comment, that you're talking about AWS EKS cluster autoscaler versus Karpenter, right? Actually, Scott, Karpenter, I know that it got support for Azure.
Karpenter is officially supported and is the best practice of Azure. It has been integrated directly into the service at the click of a button. There's an alpha provider that's part of Kubernetes SIG cluster lifecycle for cluster API integration with Karpenter.
Okay, so in those two cases, especially in case of AWS, it's huge yes. Huge yes for Karpenter. I would even argue, and I'm going to annoy some people here, that EKS cluster autoscaler or AWS cluster autoscaler, whatever it's called, that was the worst autoscaler ever. So it wasn't even hard to make it better. But Karpenter is awesome. Use it.
Less so the autoscaler was bad, just the process of enabling it and setting it up was terrible.
Oh,
it's that was the issue. It wasn't like the autoscaler itself, once you set it up, was perfectly fine, right? Like it did node groups, it did everything, like it worked. The issue was setting it up, and the whole process of doing that was terrible in EKS. Karpenter, click of a button.
Exactly. Okay. Regarding EKS from Nikos, EKS auto mode, which in your opinion, I'm not sure. Probably the question is auto mode a good thing? I haven't used it yet, so I don't know.
EKS auto mode is what EKS should have been, since it's like if EKS were to be created today, it's what it should have been. It's much closer to like what you get with like AKS. It's much closer to, again, it is a working, ready, configured Kubernetes cluster that can host your applications. I like EKS auto mode. I think they've done a great job there. I'm really happy that we see EKS and AKS going down that mode around the same time, with AKS automatic, EKS auto mode. Both of them are really making that user experience above Kubernetes much better, but in ways that are standard Kubernetes versus like Google, who I'm less of a fan of what they've done with like autopilot. What do they call it? GKE autopilot and whatever.
Autopilot.
Where it just has too many limitations of things that don't run there. And EKS auto mode and AKS automatic, just everything runs there because it's standard.
So For EKS Auto mode, I haven't used it yet, but Autopilot to me, I was impressed initially until I realized that the whole idea is just bonkers. It doesn't work. The idea, maybe it changed in the meantime, is every pod essentially gets a node, and you say, "Oh, that sounds good," right? Kind of like easy scale up, down, fast, whatever, until you realize that there are so many things that need to be around that pod. Like running a daemon set on GKE Autopilot, and sooner or later you will have a daemon set. I promise you that.
Do they even support daemon sets now? Because initially they didn't.
No. That's what I'm saying. You cannot, because every pod gets a node, right?
Exactly.
No. It's kind of converting Lambda, and I'm not very fond of Lambda, except in special use, specific cases. Specific cases is great, but people abuse it. Lambda was never a good idea for anything but specific cases, and I feel the same thing for Autopilot, GK.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott, you need to make a video about Backstage. What you're doing with it.
Okay. I will will create something and publish it somehow or whatever. I will put that in the to-do list for sure.
Dror says cluster autoscaler is also bad at runtime. In my experience, I get nodes up to 5 times faster with Karpenter. I cannot confirm 5 times faster, but yes.
Karpenter is much faster with its hook into the AWS APIs and everything. It is faster. Again, there are ways of also making cluster autoscaler much faster. It depends on how often you're doing the reconciliation loops. Are different flags to configure things. You can get cluster autoscaler relatively very performant, but it requires a lot of fine tuning. And cluster autoscaler is one of those tools that I hate for one reason. Everything is done through flags to the container and not through like a CR. And like you have to go to the GitHub repo and find the right provider and hope that it's updated the documentation, or start looking at the Go code to understand what flags are supported. And it's a nightmare. Karpenter is all CRDs. Thank you. We have something that's discoverable that I can understand. So yes, that's important.
Okay, from Paul's guitar stuff. Has DevOps stagnated as a field? Any new patterns you guys are excited about? I was disappointed with DevOps for years now. I think it's not that it's stagnated. I think that it's misunderstood. I don't think there is such a thing as DevOps engineer, so I'm very negative towards it, even though this channel is called DevOps Toolkit, riding the wave. So let me rephrase that question, Scott, and then we can answer. Kind of, are there any patterns we are excited about in ops part or cloud native or whatever we're doing?
So yes, completely. Platform engineering, I believe, is a pattern, or platform as a product is a pattern that we are starting to see being implemented, that when implemented correctly can enable a good DevOps culture, which is what DevOps actually is. Okay, DevOps is not a job. DevOps is simply the name of a bunch of different channels on YouTube, and it is a mentality, methodology, type of cultural existence. Platform engineering kind of brings that down to the ground in terms of, okay, what does this actually mean? What is the deliverable?
A good platform enables people to do DevOps, to both develop and do operations up to some extent.
Exactly. DevOps is not writing Jenkins files and writing Kubernetes YAML. That may be something that people that are in the DevOps culture do, but it is not the definition. DevOps in the Webster dictionary should not equal Jenkins and Kubernetes administrator.
That's why I'm disappointed with it. In practice, it does. In practice, everybody's doing the same thing, just change the title.
Correct.
Okay. From Ahmed, we are a small team and our product does not get so much traffic. What should be our Git branching strategy? Could you give suggestions based on your experience? I will go extreme here. I would say start by pushing directly to the main line because you're all so awesome and you have completely automated everything, testing and whatsoever, right? Which is probably not the case.
Right. Do extreme programming.
Yeah. But even if you're not so advanced, sometimes you say, I have small projects that I push directly to the main line because I and one more person are the only ones working there, and we have 5 people occasionally using and don't mind and whatever. Anyways, ignoring that extreme, I like simple. I like there is a main branch. You create a branch, you work on it, you PR, you create a pull request, you do whatever needs to be done in that pull request, you merge to the main line, goes to production.
Again, I think I agree. I think that simplicity is good as much as possible. I think that one of the biggest, I don't understand necessarily the connection between how much traffic you get and what the Git branching strategy is. The real question is it a SaaS offering or is it a off-the-shelf product? And if it is an off-the-shelf product, then you have to start dealing with release branches and a bunch of stuff like that. And if it's a SaaS offering, just keep it as simple as possible, like Victor mentioned.
Okay, this is more a statement than a question. Yeah, I think DevOps is in the phase of just needing to spread the word and implement tools, like what Red Hat is doing with Backstage. I agree with Scott. It's not a role. I would rephrase this and say, yeah, I think platform engineering is in a phase of just needing to spread the word and implement the tools. That I would be happy.
Yeah,
I could even change with SRE. Yes, I think SREs are in the phase of just needing to spread the word and implement tools. I would agree with that one as well. DevOps is a change how we work. It's more like Agile. It's closer to being to Agile than anything else in my head.
Yeah. It's about, it's like the best analogy is that versus like team topologies, right? It's about how we work with one another and what our interactions are with other people way more than what we are doing.
I mean, story in my head, and this is going to sound silly, I'm going to say it anyway, that we had Agile a long time ago, still do, right? And Agile was all about creating self-sufficient teams. Let's form a team that can write code of application, that can test, and that can have a product owner, manager, whatever you want to call it, on top of all that. And they can work basically self-sufficiently in isolation in a way and go every week, every 2 weeks, a sprint, I'm finished, I'm done, move to the next thing, amazing. And then people woke up one day and said, but we forgot about half of the experts. We forgot about half of the tasks that we need to do. The fact that you just push something to Git after you tested it does not mean that it's running in production. It ends in production. It does not end up with your Jira being closed and sent as a different issue, and a new ticket opened to some other people deal with it, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's misunderstanding what we wanted with Agile.
Correct.
And then
and almost every company that says they're Agile are the most un-Agile companies in terms of the actual word Agile.
And then the next chapter in the story is the revenge. Because the other half of the people sitting in basement that you forgot about, you never invited them to the Agile party. You never shared the cake with them, because excitement, Agile and stuff like that. Then they said, you know what? Now there is this thing called DevOps. Now it's going to be our moment. Now the second half is going to become a thing, right? Now it's our time to get the cake and open champagne bottle and be awesome, right? And the reality is that it's about combining. It's about creating self-sufficient teams. Team that can convert idea into something running in production. If you want definition of DevOps, that's that. A single team can convert an idea into something running in production. Okay, 5 minutes to go. No more questions. Okay, I see that one is coming. Have you used, from Alexander, have you used Karpenter or CI pre-provisioning or dummy pods with low priority to maintain warm capacity and react to load more efficiently? Or is SCADA with RPS-based scaling sufficient? I never liked the idea of warm nodes. I mean, of course, there are exceptions, but I think that you should start scaling not when you reach the capacity, but when you reach, let's say, I'm going to throw a random number, 80% of something, so that there is still those 20% buffer before you need scale up is finished.
Which is warm capacity in the end.
Yeah, it is like warm capacity, but instead of running idle nodes waiting for me, I prefer to actually give higher capacity, slightly higher capacity or resource requests, what's or not, to my stuff and say scale when it reaches 80%. So in other words, I prefer using those extra nodes instead of having them idle.
Well, but that's exactly the point where they actually shouldn't be idle, because if your requests and limits are not equal to one another, then as long as your requests are high enough, as long as your limits are high enough, it will utilize more than the requests, right?
Exactly.
Like there's no, so, which is why I believe having warm capacity, I think you need to set your requests correctly and not ever higher than they're needed, because again, the second you do that, then everything else goes off whack, right? If you're not right sizing your pods, then Karpenter, who is trying to right size your nodes, is going to do a bad job, because what it's been packing is wasteful pods, right? It's been packing wasteful packs. So that's very important. I think that's where tools like ScaleOps or whatever, which are amazing for right sizing pods, or VPA with Goldilocks and things like that, if you want to, do it yourself, right? In terms of figuring out what the right size is, do that for sure. Add warm pods, warm capacity into the nodes above that requests. And always, I believe that a ratio of, for like non-prod, I think that 1 to like 1.2 times of like request to limit makes sense, typically. And for like production, sometimes that's like 1 to 1.5 or 1 to 2, even depending on if you fluctuate a lot in resource usage and things like that. But in the end, warm capacity is important. But the big one, actually, I think, and this is like an interesting area. I gave a talk on this at DevConf, which is using KEDA as a cluster autoscaler with cluster API, where a lot of times we actually know when I need to autoscale. Like, I know that Black Friday is coming up. I know I'm going to have a peak, and you want to scale up in advance. So using something like a KEDA, where you can have different plugins like a scheduler, a cron almost of, on Sundays, scale up, because we need those extra nodes scaled down over the weekend when in my dev cluster, because there's no reason to have extra nodes. There are smart ways of doing this. I don't think that necessarily CA or Karpenter have made it configurable enough or advanced enough to solve the real use cases. But yes, warm capacity is a necessity. It's just a question of how you do it.
That's the last of it, and we're almost at the top of the hour. Thank you all for coming. We'll be here next week, most likely, and see you soon. Cheers.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.